Hey everyone, Cleo here, and today we are doing another Talking Arcs, which is a series in which I talk about the ARC copies that I've received. So this is a ARC copy that I was granted access to through Netgalley, so an e-ARC. I have now gotten the physical copy as well, and so today we are talking about The House of Always by Jenn Lyons. So The House of Always is the fourth book in A Course of Dragons by Jenn Lyons. As a consequence, if you haven't read the previous books within this installment, this is not a video for you. I will link the book talking I did for the first book within the series, The Ruin of Kings, up there, so that you can go and find that video, check out my thoughts about it, and see if this is a series for you. It is great fun, so I would definitely say go for it. So, The House of Always, fourth book within the series. I'm gonna start by diving into the setup of this book a little bit, and as a consequence, if you don't want to hear that, if you want to go in fully blind, then skip forward to when I put this book back up. So I'm going to put it down while discussing that, and I'll pick it back up when I have moved past that. So we start off this book with a whole ton of action. We are dropped in the middle of a sort of like action scene involving Kraken, involving undead soldiers, and all of our usual suspects. So our big cast is all together at that point in time. Through circumstances, they are pushed through a portal into the lighthouse at Shadrock Gore. And that is when we will be diving into the structure that we know so well, the structure of having a frame story, which is then our cast of characters working through some issues at the lighthouse in Shadrock Gore, and the story within the story, which is then the story leading up to that fight with the Kraken and the undead soldiers. So that is the main basic premise for how this story works out. One of the main things that I loved about this new installment within the series is the way it integrated that frame story and the story within a story. So in this one, we very much have the stories within the stories are very much forced upon characters. In all previous installments of this series, the frame story and stories within story was very much a storytelling device. You know, we had these two characters or more characters who were telling their side of a story, and the story within a story was really a story that they were telling. How complex am I making this? But in this case, the stories within stories are basically kind of visions that are forced upon our characters and that are shared within the entire group, meaning that everybody who is part of our big cast of characters is seeing these events unfold, is seeing what has taken place in the past storyline. So I really love that way. I think it integrated very well within the storyline of this book, and as it is a difference with the previous installments in this series, it kind of made it seem fresh, it kind of made it seem new, and it put some sort of like new wind into that structural element that we have been, working with for the past 3 books. I think I was not tired of seeing that previous way of structuring the story, but I think it was a nice breath of fresh air, an unexpected breath of fresh air when it came to working in that structure into this particular storyline. It also, of course, introduced a lot of character dynamics, because as a result, you have all of these characters knowing all of the stories of the other characters. Up until this point, you basically had 2 people who have been telling their story, and while at some point you have some of the other characters who have been reading those reports, who also give their opinion about what they've read, we've never really had that much like immediate reaction to what has taken place. We've always just had like Kieran's perspective on what has taken place and the other person who's telling the story. But in this one, we really see, the person who are being betrayed within a certain storyline instantly react to what has been revealed within the storyline. And so that really introduced a very interesting character dynamic. Aside from that, what I also found very interesting is that when it comes to these visions of the past to what has taken place so far, it isn't centered around Kieran, Terate, and Janelle. They are definitely part of the frame story, but when it comes to the stories within the stories, I don't really remember whether they're like not in it at all or whether they're just not a big part of those, but it definitely is the case that they aren't really centered in those storylines. So we get a lot more story time or a lot more focus on that secondary cast, on that other part of our big cast of characters, which is an interesting development and I thought was very well handled and is a way to upgrade their status, I guess, within this book, and definitely showing how you can have that cast of characters carry the story just as easily. As we all know, the Memory of Souls ended on a huge cliffhanger with Kieran asking Talon to take his life so that he can go into the prison with Volkerot and try and battle it out with him. And, you know, that was a horrible ending, but it's turned out to be a horrible decision from the get-go within this book. And I really loved that whole aspect to it. I was so much looking forward to a sort of like beautiful elder brother, younger brother relationship between Volkerot and Kieran, based off the way in which Kieran thought this was going to unfurl. We get something very different in the House of Always, because Volkerot turns out to be very different than what Kieran thought Volkerot was like. So once again, we see how Kieran's decisions are very impulsive and end up with more problems than he's actually solving through them. But I also like that we really address that as well. We really have Janelle and Terate talk to Kieran about this through circumstances they're able to. I won't really dive into how Kieran and Janelle and Terate are able to communicate to one another. That is definitely something that is established early on in the book. I just don't want to dive into that too much in this book talk, just because I don't think it's that important for me to dive into it. But so Janelle and Terate definitely do take Kieran to court, so to speak. They do definitely make sure that Kieran is aware of how they feel about his decision, how they feel about him making that decision for them, even though it affects them, as they do have such close ties. And I do like that we have that sort of like scene of accountability, that scene in which, you know, he isn't just forgiven for doing this, he isn't just made, he is definitely made to see that his decision was selfish, he was looking out for them, but as a consequence, he was also shutting them out of a decision that he shouldn't have shut them out of. So I do definitely like that sort of conversation taking place within this book, because I think that these types of decisions, these types of, you know, like self-sacrificing decisions are idolized a lot within fantasy. It is something that happens a lot within the fantasy narrative, and I don't think a lot of conversation often goes into that afterwards. I think the relief of everything having worked out fine, or the grief over it not having worked out fine, usually takes the upper hand, making it so that that conversation does not have a place within that story. But I definitely love that we have that conversation take place here, because it is a trope to have that sort of self-sacrificing hero who, you know, decides to give up his life in order to save the people around him. And I do like that we address that trope within this one, and do look at the negative side to that trope, and do look at the fact that that is a toxic trope. You are taking a decision away from somebody else. So I do love that discussion within this one. I won't dive into much more with this one, because, you know, I cannot talk about the ending, of course, which is like the main other thing which I would like to talk about when it comes to this one. I will say that, you know, what I consider the ending, what I just referred to as the ending, is not the ending. So it is kind of the ending of the main storyline that we have within this book. But as we have had it with all previous books within this series, at some point the framing story catches up to the frame story in terms of its timeline, and we move forward at that point in time. In this one, I don't know whether it is because of the fact that the framing story relationship works a little bit differently than it has so far in previous books, but when that when the stories within the story caught up to the frame story, I found that that should have been the ending, that was perfect the way it ended at that point in time. But then we kind of move back to the situation that we were introduced to at the very beginning of this book, and we have a whole more, like, I don't know, 30 pages or 40 pages maybe of that sort of situation. And at that point in time, I was kind of indifferent to it, because I had felt like we had rounded off the story and that we were just getting some more, which I didn't really care about anymore as a consequence. You know, I kind of felt like I'd closed this book off mentally already, and then I just had to suffer through some more pages afterwards, which as a consequence I also didn't necessarily pay too much attention to anymore. So I definitely need my reread in order to know whether this ends on a cliffhanger or not. But yeah, I think that just felt a little bit too disparate, I guess. There are two settings basically to the frame story. We start off the frame story in one setting, then move to another one, and then introduce the stories within the stories. And moving back to that original setting at the end of the book, it was just jarring and it didn't really work for me. So that is also my main criticism of this book, is that I felt like the moment in which we started introducing the stories within this one, that whole setting and that whole storyline felt like a whole, and I felt it wasn't integrated perfectly with the other setting in which we start and end this book. But overall, I still highly enjoyed this one. I think Memory of Souls will probably be higher on my enjoyment rating in terms of the overall book. But I will say that what I just referred to as the moment in which we introduce the stories within a story here, that whole section of this book, the majority of this book, so I might have enjoyed even more than I enjoyed Memory of Souls, but because of that problem that I just described, I will say that the overall book falls a little bit lower in the scale than Memory of Souls does for me. But overall, still highly enjoyable, has great moments between our cast of characters, has great moments when it comes to our main ship, and yeah, I am so down for the last one in this series. I am so eager to see what she is going to do with the Discord of Gods next year. But so yeah, as always, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's definitely one that's for a more limited crowd of viewers, because you have to have read the previous 3 books within the series before you can dive into this video. But if you are here and watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it gave you some idea about what to expect when it comes to the House of Always. And if you have read the House of Always and were checking out this video in order to get some idea of my feelings while reading this book, I hope that I made myself clear enough. I love this book. It just had some elements to it that structurally didn't really work for me, but overall I really enjoyed the innovation that was in this book and the continuation of all of that queer rep that we've been enjoying so much throughout the remainder of the series. But so yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video and see you guys for a future one. Bye!